Adam Courtenay, welcome to Newcastle Library, and thank you very much for joining us to talk about The Ghost and the Bounty Hunter.
Yeah, no, it's a book that came to me because I had a friend, and he was in an art gallery, and he saw all these paintings of Buckley, and he told me, he said, "Do you know have you ever heard this thing, you've got Buckleys?" And I go, "Oh, of course, yeah, everybody knows, you've heard that, you've got Buckleys." He said, "Well, I just saw art of this guy called Buckley, and this is where it comes from. This is a guy who lived with Aboriginal people for 30 years. I go, what are you talking about? I don't know what you're talking about."
So this is the origin of the story with you.
This is the origin of the story. Guy saw Buckley's pictures at an art gallery, and then in my research, I then found out that he's almost become an icon. There are so many pictures. You go to the Victorian State Library.
Yes.
You go to the art gallery, there's pictures of Buckley everywhere.
Yeah, right.
He was a big icon in the 1860s. So the more I found out, I did some research, and I thought, well, this sounds interesting. How many guys do we know, white guys that have lived with Aboriginal people?
Yes.
And then it turns out he was the first guy to have ever done it. Then it turns out that they thought he was a returned kin. They thought he was actually a ghost returned.
Right.
And so it just became more the Ghost yes. and the Bounty Hunter.
Yes.
And I just became more and more interesting because it was a mixture of convict meeting Aboriginal people, and there's got to be some kind of explosion going on there. I'll tell you how I got to it. And a friend of mine is an art aficionado, and he was at some gallery somewhere in Sydney, and he saw these paintings of Buckley, and he said, "There's a story about Buckley." He was learning from the art. He said, this guy lived with the Aboriginals for 30 years. And I go, "What is that?" And he said, "That's where we get the thing, you've got Buckleys." And I go, "What? The Buckleys, you got Buckley's Chance, you got Buckley's Hope."
That term that we all use.
The term we all use. I thought, that's interesting. I never asked myself who the Buckley was on the Buckleys.
The Buckley?
Exactly. So he said, "That's who it is." And I thought, and he said, "Mate, you've got to do the story." And this guy lived with them for 32 years. He came back, he couldn't speak English when he came out. And I'm going, "Yeah, this sounds interesting." And I'd written about convicts, as you probably know. And I wanted to do something about the Indigenous people, and this just seeged perfectly. He was a convict, as I was learning in my research, who fled a settlement, and then was discovered half dead by the Wadawurrung people in Geelong, and they took him in, and they thought he was a ghost. They thought he was returned kin.
Right.
And so everything I was learning everything was fascinating. We've got him living with them rather than the other way around, which is most of the history. And we've got a convict who fled. The other thing about Buckley is there's other things. He was 6'5". He was a huge man, 6'5" and 7'8".
Yeah.
I think even a guy like me, I'm 5'7". I would have been tall in those days, but he was gargantuan in those days.
So literally standing
I saw it in my head. There's this giant man, and he lives with the Aboriginal people, and it's incredible. So I just kept on researching, and everything I came up, I thought, why don't I know about this? We use this expression, "You've got Buckleys," and nobody knows anything about it.
And here's the origin point for us.
Yeah.
Tell us more about this, where he was discovered and they thought he was a ghost.
Yeah. Well, what happened was he fled the colony. It was the first time they settled Victoria. It was in Sorrento, in the lower eastern side of Port Phillip Bay. He fled with 6 others. All the other 5 didn't make it. He was out there alone, and he existed for about 3 or 4 months.
Yes, right.
And sort of lived off berries and pig face, which is a little sort of fruit, and he drank water from leaves and stuff, but he was getting pretty weak. Next thing we know, he's stumbling towards a part of the Bellarine Peninsula, and he's in a little creek, and he tries to go over the creek, and he just makes it, and then he collapses. 3 Aboriginal women from the Wadawurrung tribe came and resuscitated him, and gave him water and something, and they were all screaming and shouting, and they said, and the reason they was because the day before he'd picked up a spear of a dead warrior.
Dead Indigenous warrior.
Dead Indigenous warrior, I should say. No. Dead Indigenous warrior. And they just presumed that if he had this spear, it was him, because they believed when you died, you came back as a white person.
As the spirit.
As a spirit.
Yes.
And so they never even asked the question. They said, "You've got the spear." The warrior was a tall guy too.
Yes.
Didn't matter if he didn't look the same, wrong skin colour, didn't matter. They said, "You are Murunguk."
Yes.
And he said, he's not understanding anything. Why is everybody screaming? Why are they looking at, and they look after him, and they give him the best food, and he's just going, "Huh? What have I done?" Sort of thing.
It's fantastic. Yes.
So that's how it started, his Indigenous career, I should say.
So then he's adopted into the tribe.
Yeah,
and
he's adopted. Yeah.
Did he have much Indigenous law or understanding before then?
Nothing.
Or?
He would have known nothing. But they think that he would have started to be reasonably fluent in the language in about 6 to 9 months, and in 2 years probably spoke it quite well. I think he would have been in it. One thing you have to say about Buckley is he was a giant, 6'5" and 7/8, but he was one of those. He's a smart enough guy to know just go with the flow, and so I think they were apparently extremely careful with him, explaining everything in the language, and he got the language bit by bit.
Yes.
And slowly but surely, he began to understand what was expected from him. So he'd come back, and they thought he was Murungut, and suddenly, this is the interesting thing, he had a family because it's him come back. So he had a sister, a sister and a brother-in-law and two nephews. And he's expected from this tribe as the replacement guy who died. And they treated him really well because the funny thing about it is that they thought, we let him die once. Yes. We're not going to let him die twice.
You're right. Look after him.
Look after him. So he's never allowed to fight.
Yes.
He was always allowed. They said, when there's a fight, there's going to be a fight. Yeah. You've got to go 100 metres, 100 yards away. And you go with the women and children.
Yes, right.
So he's a 6'5" guy, not involved, and it's funny. It's something that you can conjure up really interesting images of this enormous guy being looked after and
absolutely.
Yeah.
And of course, that's probably the natural spot for that saying, Buckley's chance of surviving or doing something from there.
Well, look, see, this is what I don't understand. If it does come from Buckley, and there's contention over whether Buckley, the expression "you've got Buckley's chance, you've got Buckley's hope," comes from him, they think it does. And if it does, I think there's an ironic thing because Buckley they gave him the chance. It was the Indigenous people who gave him the chance. Yet we say it in a negative way, mate, you've got Buckley's, meaning you've got no chance at all. So I don't know why there's an irony there because Buckley's chance means he had lots of chance and he was given a chance. He wouldn't have survived without them. There's no way he would have survived on his own. Yeah.
So the other part of this book is the bounty hunter.
Ah, yes.
Tell us about Mr. Batman.
Mr. Batman. Yeah, look, people see him as this terrible bounty hunter figure, and yes, he is all those things. I think he's just a man who's incredibly ambitious, who whatever the government or the powers of that time asked him to be and to do, he would do. So the interesting thing about Batman is that at the beginning, he lived in the north part of Tasmania, and he'd come from Sydney, actually, from Parramatta. He was a natural bushman. He'd grown up with Aboriginal people. I believe his father was a Protestant, a certain kind of Protestant that didn't, the Aboriginal people and the white kids all mixed together. Yes. That was part of the religion apparently. So he knew Aboriginal people really well. So he goes there, and I believe in the first few years they get on well, but then the government doesn't want them there, and of course he wants more land, he wants a position, he's ambitious, so he goes on the bounty hunting. So he switches. So he's one of these characters that will one day be the friend and the next day be something else.
Yes.
And there's an interesting, the quite famous artist, his name I can't remember, it's in the book, said that Batman is an absolute devil because you think that he's a good guy and he's really out there only for himself.
Flips.
And then of course the story with Batman is that he wanted to get land on the mainland because Tasmania wasn't big enough for him, really.
Yeah, right. Okay.
And so then we come to I don't know if we want to go that far ahead first, but we come to 1835 where he actually goes out and tries to do a deal with the Aboriginal elders in the Melbourne area.
Because we should remind people, this is pre
the colony. Yeah. So let's get it straight. Buckley was in the very first settlement that failed in 1803. He fled in late 1803 into 1804. So he lived for 32 years before Batman and his people arrived in 1835. Yes. And that's the founding of Melbourne.
Yes, right.
So the founding of Melbourne was 32 years basically, 32 years after Buckley. So by then he was an Indigenous person who hadn't seen a white man in that amount of time, nor talked to them at any point, we believe.
And that's where we think he's completely lost touch with them?
Yeah, he's totally lost it. There's the story, and I do it in the prologue, is about his first return to white society. When Batman left some people there were 8 people he left at St Leonard's, which is on the Bellarine Peninsula. Buckley comes up to the camp and he couldn't speak with them because he didn't remember. And then he's talking to them, and they're talking. He's sort of kind of listening, and he says, "I don't want to tell him who I am anyway." But because let's remember, he's an escaped convict.
Yes.
And as an escaped convict, he's a bit scared. What do I tell him? What do I do?
Yes.
But he couldn't speak the language anyway. And suddenly he said, it was like a cloud passing over my brain. Somebody passed him some bread, and he went, bread. First English word that he came out with. And after that, it just kind of it took him a couple of weeks, and I don't believe he spoke fluent English even afterwards. You know, he was more of his life had been a Wadawurrung person.
Yes.
He spoke their language he spoke that language, and the language around that whole area of the Kulin Nation. There's 4 other tribes, and they were very similar, and they were very close all around the Port Phillip area, and they were very close, and they all spoke a very similar. There would have been probably a different dialect of the same language, something like that. But he could speak to them. He could speak to the people in Melbourne as well as he could people of Geelong, and they were different people.
Yes, yeah.
I think I've answered your question.
No, that's good. This is largely reframing history a bit too, isn't it? We're relearning what we thought was. Is that correct?
I don't know. That's a big. I don't count myself as a historian. I count myself as a popular history writer. But if anything, I want to find the stories that the historians seem to have missed. And I think the Buckley story is known in the Geelong area, it's known in Melbourne, but I think it's a story that has a greater importance because, you know, the whole of Australia was, Buckley came, the most important thing is, we talked about 1835, he was made the go-between, and he saw at first hand what white men did in Australia. That happened to be Melbourne, but it's similar to what happened all around the country. Melbourne was interesting because it's not really talked about. Now, you asked me if I discovered it. I don't think I discovered anything. There's historians that talked about it. But you have to tell it in a way that people will understand. And Buckley was a perfect vehicle for this. He was a guy who was, for want of a word, half Indigenous, half white, who wanted to be on both. He's originally a white guy who went over the other side, and now he's been asked by the white people to be the go-between. So it's a perfect story in that sense. So if I'm rewriting it from a different angle.
Yes.
I don't think I'm discovering anything new. There's no new facts that I've created. But it's always in the angle, I think. It's in the angle of showing how things happen. So if you can show to the reader how a white man with Aboriginal culture, if you want, or Indigenous culture, seeing what his own people, the white people, were doing to his other own people, if that makes sense, you've got a story there, I think, of ambivalence and not, you know, and a great, you know, confusion in many ways. And I think there was a lot of confusion in where his loyalties lay.
Yes.
And that was. But anyway, the question you asked is, am I telling it? And I'm not telling a new story. It's well known, the Buckley story, but I think I'm telling it in a new way. I'd like to think I am anyway.
And it is a story. Well, it's one story that evolves into a bigger story, isn't it? In a way.
Yeah. Well, look, that's kind of what I like to write stories that are great stories in themselves. I think the Buckley living with the Indigenous people is a great story in itself, but it has to be a part of important history. The making of Melbourne, the creation of Melbourne, is it's the second biggest city in Australia, and it's an important one. And it's I wanted to create a great story within a wider scope, and this is really about. It's about Buckley, but it's about why there wasn't any conciliation and the reason for it.
Yes.
And it's another story of conquest with the Buckley story added in. So for me to take a story the whole way through, I need to have that sense of social history going on, and then I feel really happy that I'm putting the character in the right setting. So I'm always looking for that kind of story.
Yes, yeah. And tell us what happens with Buckley as he starts interacting again with white people.
I think he's enormously reserved, and the white people seem to think the guys, they called him half savage because they seem to believe that Buckley should have been there in the 32 years proselytising Christianity, and by the time they arrived, they'd all be good Christians. I mean, the stupidity of the settlers is just beyond me. Of course, he's one white guy among 10 to 15,000 people they thought were in Port Phillip Bay during his heyday. What was he going to do? So that because he hadn't educated them or Christianized them, they thought he's gone over to their side. He's not really a white, educated, he's not one of us. So they saw him as there was a guy called Courtenay, the other founder. He kept on telling people that Buckley, this is the great joke. Courtenay would say two things to people so that they would mistrust Buckley. They'd say that he's a dolt and an idiot and doesn't reason properly because he's a savage. Yes. The other thing they said was he's a great rebel who's going to let the savages or the Aboriginal people, he's going to lead them to killing us all. Yeah, right. So what is he going to be? Is he going to be a dolt or is he going to be a great great leader?
Yes.
So, and people go, oh yeah. So they never trusted him. And this was the problem that happened to Buckley. He wasn't white, he wasn't black. They didn't trust him. And of course, the white people are asking him to do all their dirty work. Yes. There's a famous story where Batman arrives and he says, now, we're all friends and you're all equal, but if you kill one of us, we're going to kill you like a kangaroo. And Buckley's the man who has to say it. He's the man who has to mouth it.
Yes.
So they're thinking, this is our man Murungurk talking with white tongue.
Yes.
Is it him talking or is it the white people? So they think that he's now selling them out.
Yes.
So the indigenous Wadawurrung and the people around them, they think he's selling them out, and the white people think he's a savage and an idiot. So he couldn't win on either front.
So did he exist in a kind of no man's land?
He did. It's a very good way of putting it. I never thought he wasn't any person's man.
Yes.
And that's why he left. He was the go-between, then he was a policeman. But really all he was doing was trying to sort of settle little Band-Aid problems.
Yes.
But the onslaught of white greed and rapaciousness was just so enormous. Buckley could never stop that.
Yes, it's too big.
And he saw it all coming. And he knew what was happening. And funnily enough, I don't make much of this in the book, but he'd seen his own farm in England, in Cheshire, as a boy, taken from him by the government.
Yes.
And I don't make a huge amount about that, but I think I make the point that he could see what was happening. The powers were coming to get his Wadawurrung friends, and they'd take it no matter what. He'd seen dispossession twice in his life.
Yes.
He knew what was happening. And he said, I don't want any of this. The whites don't like me. The black guys, my black friends, my Aboriginal friends think that I'm selling them out. And he went to live in Tasmania and lived for the next 20 years with a fairly sedate lifestyle. Married, there's a big funny one, he married a 4'8" Irish woman. Right. He's a 6'6" guy, and apparently they had to hold it, to hold her up or something with using some sort of a band where they I don't know how it worked exactly. Yeah, right. But they didn't have any children. She had her own children. Her husband had died previously to their marriage. But he lived a very sedate life in Tasmania. And he worked as a courier. He was a doorman. Very simple. I mean, this is not an educated guy. He was always illiterate. Yes, right. And
illiterate, yet he could speak the multiple languages.
Yeah, he could speak that language. But he would have learned it without writing, because they didn't have writing, did they? The Aboriginal people. But the story is not the beginning of his life, but it's the middle. I think is the strong part of this story. And then, just to tell the end, he was on a horse and cart and it turned over and he broke his back. This is about 1870 something, and he died at 76. A few months later, I think. Just had enough.
Excellent. That was it. Amazing.
And a very, he was famous. Famous for the only man who had done that, and in that century, other people were marooned because they often see people that were marooned with Aboriginal people on the coast. Buckley was more than marooned; he was embedded.
Yes,
he was
that's
part
right.
Of it.
He was part.
He was part of it. Yeah.
Yes. It sounds too like he almost has had a very passive life, but it's just been at the forces of others. Is that right?
That's how I felt a lot about this. It's typical of, I think, that time. He was a guy who was forced off his land as a kid, was, for want of a better word, forced to become an apprentice bricklayer because there's nothing a country boy could do. He didn't want it, he hated that. He thought, the army, Napoleon's coming, this is the 1790s, the French are coming, I'll enlist. So then he's forced to become a soldier.
Yes.
Then after the soldier, he becomes a convict. His only freedom, the first time he had any freedom, was when he'd escaped the convict colony in Sorrento in 1803. And of course that was only brief, and then he was for want of a word, forced to become a Wadawurrung people. Well,
Yes.
he had no choice. He
Yes,
had to
he had
become,
to
or he couldn't go against. And I think in Tasmania he found his real freedom. He was just a simple guy, a gentle giant, 6'6", gentle giant, who just wanted to be left alone. But
Yes.
nobody ever, they never left it. He was never allowed to be left alone.
He was never circumstance.
No, it's always, and I think it's quite typical of that generation that they were used by powers to be something that they didn't want to be. He had no power over his life in a way that we understand it, and he had no choices.
Yes.
But you know, he had his chance, Buckley's chance with the
Yes.
with the whatever.
Yeah. Let's talk about that being used by powers. Was there a time when Batman arrived where there was harmony for a while?
Yes,
between
there
them?
was. I think that the first. Before Melbourne was called Melbourne, it was called Bear Brass, and I think it was. I'm not sure where it was a corruption of an Aboriginal word. I think Batman's Hill, where Batman lived, was called Berraboop or something like that. Excuse me, probably not. My pronunciation's terrible, but that's where I think they got it. So Bear Brass for the first year, 1835 into mid 1836, was as Aboriginal as it was white. But of course, what happens? The more white people come, they hear about this incredible grazing land
Yes.
that Batman
Yes.
was the first among the first to see. In fact, if you go way back, you go back to Matthew Flinders, who saw it in 1802 and said, "This is the best grazing land in the world."
Yes, right.
And then Batman heard about this and said, "This is fantastic." So more and more people. So slowly the balance shifted. And I think it was in mid-1830s. What happened was a man called Charles Franks. I think it was 1836 or 1837. It's in the book. I should know. But he was killed, and he was a big landowner. And he was killed, and no one understood why, and there was great outrage. I'm pretty sure that this was 1836, actually. And that's when the tide, in my opinion, I'm just giving you my opinion, I don't know what historians say, because they went bounty hunting. And Batman himself didn't. Funnily enough, his brother did. And they went bounty hunting to get the guy that killed Franks. And then that's when they had guns, and there was enough of them. And they thought that was an excuse to start the invasion, a real invasion. And then they took over land. The Aboriginal people they gave it back as good as there wasn't some passive. They gave back.
Yes.
As more and more came in, the onslaught was,
That's right.
was
The
just
numbers
too much.
and
The numbers just
firepower.
were. And Buckley, it's another thing that he would see.
Yes.
And he would see it and he'd say, "I know what's happening here."
Yep.
They mouthed, for the first year they mouthed, we're going to be conciliators and we're going to be nice.
Yes.
This is a takeover.
Yes.
It's a full takeover. And by then, funnily enough, Batman was suffering seriously from syphilis. So he even pretty much from the time he arrives in Melbourne, he's useless. He's not one of these. Faulkner becomes the big voice, the big talking voice in the colony.
Yes.
And Faulkner, of course, says we must revenge this. And then the newspapers come back and say, how dare they? So they went and killed, I think they believed, between 12 and 15 Aboriginal as a reprisal for the killing of Charles Frank. And this is the thing that makes me, what the hell? Nobody even knew Charles Franks. He was some guy.
A landowner.
But he was a landowner. But the fact is that Aboriginal people had killed a landowner. If they can kill him, they can kill them.
Yes.
Fear-mongering. And it's fear-mongering.
Yes.
And so Faulkner would have said, if you let this happen, it'll happen again. And of course, they go, and then there's another situation. Two lawyers, one called Gellibrand, were lost in the woods. Same thing again. This is probably 1837. They go looking for them, and they just presume they'd been killed, and they hadn't.
Yes.
Buckley says, "Let me go out and find them. I'll speak to the people. I'll find out what happened to them." But of course, he's not allowed to go out alone because they don't trust him. They think he's going to do something. So all these white parties go out to try and find Gellibrand and Hess, I think was the other man's name. And of course, they don't find anything.
Yes.
But Buckley finds through his intelligence, because he knows everyone in the area, they just died in the woods.
Yes.
But then one of the white parties killed some Aboriginal people as a reprisal for these people who weren't even killed in the first place.
Yes.
And Buckley says, "This is the worst thing.
Yes.
This is the worst thing that he actually says it in the book, the John Morgan book. This is the worst thing that could have happened. This is where the trust is going to break."
Yes.
And of course, from then on, it was just terrible.
And it's just snowballs.
It's
completely
snowballs.
out of proportion.
And every landowner now thinks that they're going to be killed, which is absolutely untrue. And I believe, what do I know? I'm not an agronomist, But if things had been properly worked out, there could have been space
Yes.
for everybody.
Yep.
But it's never going to
No.
work that way. That's naive, I think. But it could have happened, I think, in my dreams, perhaps.